Good afternoon. Welcome back. This is Geography 130, Lecture 2. Are there any housekeeping issues that you want to bring up right now? Books, that kind of thing. I thought I got an email from somebody asking me to put the Livy Bacci reading on BSpace, but I thought that I'd heard that the book was actually available, so I wasn't sure. I maybe misremembering. No? Okay. We've not yet delivered the readings to the copy shop to make the reader, but we haven't forgotten. So, really, no questions. Great. Then we can just get started then. I want to talk today about households, biodiversity, urbanization and suburbanization, the economies of scale, and globalizing the American dream. This may seem like a somewhat odd place to start the semester as far as readings, but in many ways, this is just a sort of an illustration almost. The idea here is to simply problematize the question of population and natural resources by indicating one variable that comes in between them, so to speak. Household size. Seems like something we wouldn't necessarily even think of. Seems fairly simple. But it turns out that it might be a more valuable or more useful way of thinking about the relationship between humans and the environment than gross population. It may be that it's actually the number of households, human households, in the world that matters more than the number of humans. And that's the point of these two short readings from Nature. And then the slightly longer article tries to offer more details about the social, political, and market factors that mediate that. And that's when we'll get into suburbanization and the American dream, that kind of thing. So, the household. What is this thing? In many ways, it's the basic unit of social and biological reproduction. It's something that anthropologists have studied at great detail and for a long time. In many ways, it's the sort of smallest unit of anthropological inquiry. And again, it's a different unit, obviously, than just the individual. It might be tempting to think that the basic unit of social reproduction is mother, father, have child, right? Sort of two individuals who reproduce. But that kind of like isolated nuclear family is the exception, not the rule, if you think about the ways in which social reproduction and biological reproduction of humans has been organized in most places at most times. Generally speaking, the household is not simply a couple and their offspring. It involves a larger and more diverse set of people. It almost invariably articulates not just with reproduction in the sort of primary biological sense, but kinship, which is a source of tremendous complexity and diversity in the anthropological literature. Kinship meaning families, lineages, clans, all of the complicated ways in which affinity and consanguinity, what do those mean? What's affinity in the anthropological kinship sense of the term? By? No. Yes? Related by marriage. Affines, in the anthropological sense, are people you are related to by marriage and not by blood. Consanguinity is by blood, right? With blood. Simple, they seem like simple pairs of concepts, but you go out and you actually look at the way human societies have organized these household units, and the array of complexity is extraordinary. You're talking about multiple generations with multiple affinal and consanguinal patterns that can be found in any given place. And these, again, think of this as perhaps a better way of beginning the inquiry of human natural resource relationships than the individual, right? We're perhaps pre-programmed to think in terms of the individual and individual impacts on the environment. But if you look in a lot of societies, the idea that there is sort of an isolated individual is not only kind of bizarre, but utterly inapplicable. Because you don't find isolated individuals. You only find individuals embedded in these patterns of relationships that involve not just their mother and father or their brother or sister, but cousins and uncles and aunts and in-laws and the whole nine yards. And these, it also can include non-family members. Frequently it does. Sometimes there are people who aren't family members in our strict sense of the term, but who are called by kinship terms, who get adopted in and treated as if they were cousins and called cousins or aunts and uncles or that kind of thing, even though, technically speaking, they're not. So the diversity here is enormous. And when we look at the data in this article suggesting that household size, average household size, is declining, remember that this frequently is accompanied by a sort of shedding of these other members of your typical household. As you go from a household that does include multiple generations and all kinds of sort of beyond nuclear relations, down to what we here frequently think of as normal, which is just a nuclear family, parents and their kids. All right, any questions? So, average household sizes in different parts of the world. And here we're talking about what's the number of people, on average, who inhabit a single housing unit, right? Whether it's a house, a freestanding single-family home, whether it's an apartment, whether it's a hut. What's the average number of people who reside there? In the United States in 2003, it was 2.61. Ranging from a high in Utah of just over 3 to a low in the District of Columbia of 2.14. So you can see that the average household in the United States does not even include 2 parents and 1 child. This was down from 5.5 on average in 1850 and 4.5 in 1925. So you can see that this has dropped significantly over the last 150 years. In Latin America in 2001, the average was 4.76, so almost twice the U.S. average. In Asia, 5.14, Sub-Saharan Africa, 5.25, and the Near East and North Africa, 5.65. The argument of the 2 papers from Nature, and one is sort of the primary article reporting the findings of a study. The other is sort of an opinion piece summarizing the findings and contextualizing it more broadly. So these 2 articles basically are saying that declining household size is more important in driving energy consumption than population growth is. That if you try to explain if you sort of disaggregate the variables driving patterns in overall energy use and consumption, you will find that more of that change is explained by the number of households than by the number of people. in a given location. So even if your population were to be static, declining household size would mean more households, which in turn would mean greater consumption of energy and other resources. They go on to say that this trend is more pronounced in hotspot countries than it is in non-hotspot countries, and that this is therefore a threat to biodiversity conservation. Everyone know what a hotspot country is? There is an interesting problem with this argument. It's unclear? Anybody know what hotspot means? Yes. Okay. Okay. It means two things, hotspot. It means first that there's a high degree of, or high number of species that are rare or endemic, which is to say limited to a specific place, not widespread, and that are threatened by human activities. And we'll see, here are some hotspots mapped across the world. Here is a map of the entire world attempting to sort of portray diversity zones only for vascular plants. And you can see that there are definite patterns in terms of the diversity of vascular plants found in different parts of the world. The higher diversity of plants tend to be concentrated in the tropics, by and large, with a handful of exceptions. But so anybody see a problem in the way this argument is being constructed? The argument about the threat to biodiversity? Let me go back. If being a hotspot means you have a high number of species, so, high diversity of species that are threatened, what's the trouble with this argument? I mean, the argument here is that the hotspot countries, yes? I'm not quite sure. Right. So most of the hotspots are in the tropics. The tropics tend, by and large, to be places where the household size is larger as of the present. Okay. There's a larger number of species to be threatened there, and therefore, but here the pattern that they're depicting is one in which what really stands out from their data is that almost all of the countries in hotspot areas have this very high rate of increase in household numbers, right? Numbers of households. Whereas the non-hotspot countries don't show nearly as strong a pattern. Yeah.
Because those countries have already developed more household sizes before when they were developing, and now these are newly developing countries?
That is true, but that by itself doesn't get us to this issue of hotspots, right? I mean, the striking pattern is that for some reason there's this correlation, or appears to be a correlation, between rapidly shrinking household size and high biodiversity, or rather hotspotness. Now, I just want to point out that there is at least the potential for circularity in this argument. And the reason is this, yes. Yes.
Are they threatened by the presence of household here, or could it essentially be the resources of something else that they're also?
That's a good question. What constitutes being threatened, right? That's really what is the problem in this argument. Yeah.
Well, like you said, the resources that are needed to keep these species alive are being threatened by the onslaught of population of the household.
Well, there you go, though. If part of the definition of being a hotspot country is that there is human threat to whatever species are there, then you have sort of predetermined in your definition of your categories that when you go to examine household size, which is one of the dominant threats, the increasing number of households is part of what it means to be humanly threatening these species. You are at least potentially setting yourself up to find a pattern that you built into your definition to start with. You see what I'm saying? And I just point this out, not to say that this is some kind of gaping problem with the argument, but I do find it rather odd that that really basic question is not addressed or even raised in either the paper or the op-ed piece that goes with it, right? There's a kind of slippage here, which it strikes me should have been clarified. They should have found a way to define hotspot that didn't already contain the idea of growing household numbers as a threat to the habitat of the high diversity. That's what I mean. Anyway, let's look a little bit further at this biodiversity idea. What does it mean, first of all? And I think it's worth interrogating here because this is one of the most prevalent metrics used to think about human impacts on the environment and the long-term viability of the biosphere, right? Biodiversity and the loss of biodiversity is an extremely powerful discursive tool in debates about the environment and the future of the Earth and the future of humans on the Earth, that sort of thing. But what does it mean? The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines it as the variety of all forms of life from genes to species through to the broad scale of ecosystems. Which is to say, it basically includes everything. Right? And I mean not just, it doesn't even necessarily be limited to living organisms. Right? I mean, at the level of genes, we can talk about heterozygosity and the diversity within genetic material, but we can also blow this all the way up to the level of things that include non-animate or inanimate objects, like landscapes. We can talk about diversity of landscapes being a part of biodiversity. And in fact, measurements indexes of that sort have been developed and are kicked around. Usually, in debates about biodiversity, we're talking about the biodiversity of species, and frequently that's further limited in effect to plants and animals, and not necessarily, say, bacteria. Anybody have any idea how well we can measure biodiversity, even limited to plants and animals? How much confidence have you got in measurements of biodiversity? Lots, a little, some? When somebody tells you that such and such a place is incredibly biodiverse, do you have any, what kind of authority do you assign to that? Yeah.
Teacher in high school, biology teacher, just explained that there's so many places, like particularly in the Amazon, that plants haven't even discovered yet. So they can give a number of how many different types of species are there, but then there's this X amount, almost unlimited amount of species of bacteria if you want to go there.
Okay, even if you limit this to plants and animals, the error bars, the margins of error or of uncertainty simply, on our knowledge of the diversity of forms of life on the Earth are enormous, right? It's a small fraction of the whole that we have even described and cataloged. And you start getting into insects and bacteria, and it's absurd, right? I mean, so just remember, when anybody talks to you about biodiversity, that you're already talking about something for which we are working largely with estimates that are frequently extrapolated from what we know to be extremely limited actual data. Which is, again, not to say that there's nothing to this. What are you doing? How do I make you go away? There we go. But simply to say that this is a concept that you might want to use with a little bit of, you want to put a little asterisk next to it and ask yourself, how much do we really know? And it's furthermore, I mean, essentially, it's hard to exclude anything from this concept. And it's very difficult to operationalize this concept in a way that is fully robust and coherent and rigorous. It's amazing how much traction it has on our discussions about the natural world, given its limitations in terms of actual verification or validation on the ground. It's also remarkable how laden it is with various kinds of affective and symbolic significance, right? You Google image biodiversity, and this is the kind of thing you get. Isn't it pretty? It's the whole world. It's pretty salamanders and flowers and so forth. It's happy mothers. What is she doing exactly? And is he taking a hike in the heath? I guess. He's attacking a giant frog or just staring at a giant frog. These chicks desperately need to be fed or something. Down here, any idea? Is that through a microscope? I'm not sure. Here's an ant. That's good. Or an insect at least, because there are quite a few of those. In any case, again, I would encourage you to think about the ways in which biodiversity and the species that are flagship symbols for the loss of biodiversity, the endangered species, the way in which they get, they come to be carriers of these symbolic and culturally mediated significances that in ways that can really far outstrip the scientific grasp of, or the sort of knowledge base on which these claims rest. And I mean, I'm trying to think if we will, I don't know if we have a really good example of that we'll discuss. Yeah, actually, there will be one coming up later. We're going to talk about prairie dogs. But I would urge you to keep your eyes out for those kinds of things, right? I mean, right now there's plenty of examples you can think of right away. Polar bears and global warming being, one. But it's a remarkably powerful concept. It's also, upon really close scrutiny, a remarkably slippery one. So, anything else we need to say about this? Are there any questions? All right, let's move on to Lychenko and Solecki. This is the longer article, Exporting the American Dream. We might see this again as an effort to elaborate on exactly how or why household sizes are decreasing and therefore household numbers are increasing in many parts of the world, including the poorer parts of the world or the global south or the tropical parts of the world. The parts of the world that the other articles are concerned are sort of harboring significant biodiversity. Globalization, they argue, is fostering suburban patterns of land use, sprawl, in less developed countries. This is driven by regional, intranational migration more than by population growth. There again, you look at the data, you disaggregate the factors, and it's not so much about gross population growth. It's about the movement of people within countries. It's about the migration of significant numbers of people from rural countryside parts of countries into cities. So again, it may be less about gross population than it is about the distribution of population across the landscape. This leads, they say, to increased consumption of water and fossil fuels, increased air and water pollution, and loss of agricultural lands and natural habitats. They point out that in many parts of the world, cities are growing in terms of area much faster than they are growing in terms of population. Right? 4 times as fast. The rate of growth in area of cities in China, I believe they say, is 4 times the rate of growth in the population of those cities. Interestingly, that pattern can be found right here in the United States over the past 50 years as well. This is a very, very widespread phenomenon. So their conclusion, globalization in its present trajectory is neither environmentally nor socially sustainable. Can anybody describe for me some of the constitutive parts of globalization that they identify as driving this? I mean, they're singling out globalization. Yes.
Talking about foreign investment.
Okay.
That is bringing certain types of manufacturing and putting that manufacturing in places that's not regulated or very loosely regulated.
Okay.
And drawing a lot of people out of the cities to work there. At the same time, taking people from the country and bringing them into the city to look for them.
So one of the things they define as constitutive of globalization is a general opening up of investment and deregulation of finance, particularly international finance, to encourage what's called foreign direct investment, FDI, which tends to draw capital from places like the United States or Europe or Japan into other countries to finance things like factories, production facilities, taking advantage of various kinds of trade policies, tax benefits, cheap labor, that kind of thing. And this globalization in the form of this neoliberalization, opening up of investment, tends to build big cities by attracting people to the areas where these factories are being built. That's one. And they go on to point out that in turn generally generates income for the people working there, which they turn around and use for consumption decisions locally, right? They start having the cash they need to buy a house or build a house or sort of get into larger houses, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Except that hand in hand with that is that lots of industrially produced commodities from overseas a lot of times said that the money that they're getting from these factories is being spent on commodities that don't necessarily reinforce local economic patterns.
Okay.
Disadvantages the local economic patterns.
The point here being that frequently the same opening up that provides for foreign direct investment also provides for the influx of manufactured goods from elsewhere, and therefore those local purchases may in fact flow out of the country in terms of returns to other companies. I grant that that's the case. The point I'm just summarizing the article in which they point out that the foreign direct investment can then have knock-on effects in terms of local consumption, separate from or in addition to foreign production investment. That's all. Okay. What else? Yeah.
Another reason they stated was that increased agricultural competition, so centralizing farming methods will harm local farmers who can't compete, and then farmers will move to cities so that they can make better living.
Okay, so there are push factors as well as pull factors involved in the migration of people from countryside to cities, to urban areas. If you open up international agricultural markets or open up national markets to international agricultural competition by reducing trade barriers and things like that, you can undercut local production, farmers who are not able to compete with much larger farmers from over